My parents kicked me out of the house to make me independent, but I bought their house and tripled the rent. Hello, Reddit. Before we get into this, do me a favor. If you're reading this, hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and turn on notifications. Seriously, this channel doesn't get nearly as many views as it should, and most people don't even stick around till the end. So if you want more crazy real-life stories like this, show some support. Alright, let's get into it. I never expected a simple dinner conversation to completely upend my life, but here we are. For context, I'm Alex, 23 years old, and still living with my parents, Richard and Karen. They're the kind of people who believe they know exactly how my life should go, strict, traditional, and obsessed with control. It's not like they're bad people, but they run our house like a corporate boardroom, with rules, expectations, and absolutely no room for negotiation. I've always been the obedient son. I followed their plan, went to business school, and did everything the right way, even though I knew deep down that it wasn't what I wanted. My dream has always been IT, coding, software development, anything tech-related. But my parents see programming as some hobby at best, a dead-end job at worst. They have this vision of me in a crisp suit, working at some prestigious firm, climbing the corporate ladder like a good little soldier. So, for years, I just kept my mouth shut and went along with it. But last night, I finally snapped. We were having dinner, the usual overly formal family meal where I had to sit up straight, use the correct fork, and pretend like we were in some 1950s sitcom. My dad was droning on about the importance of discipline in career choices, while my mom nodded along like a loyal executive assistant. I wasn't really listening. My mind was somewhere else, stuck on the decision I'd made earlier that day. I was going to switch my major to computer science. It wasn't a spontaneous choice. I'd spent months researching, looking into job prospects, seeing what skills I needed, and even secretly taking online coding courses at night. I knew this was what I wanted, what I needed, and I was finally going to tell them. Mom, Dad. I started, setting my fork down carefully, my heart pounding in my chest. I've been thinking a lot about my future, and I've decided to switch my major to computer science. Silence. Not just silence, absolute stillness. Like I'd just announced I was quitting school altogether to become a traveling magician. My dad's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. My mom blinked twice, then slowly placed her napkin down, like she was preparing for a battle she already knew she'd win. My father was the first to speak. You're joking, he said, his voice perfectly calm, but there was a sharp edge beneath it. I swallowed hard. No, I've given it a lot of thought, and my mom scoffed, shaking her head. Alex, you don't know what you're talking about. Computer science? What are you going to do? Sit in front of a screen all day like some antisocial nerd? I already do that. I shot back, trying to keep my voice steady. And I love it. I've been taking coding courses, and She cut me off with a dismissive wave. Alex, you've always been easily swayed by trends. Remember when you wanted to be a chef after watching that cooking show? Or when you thought you'd be a writer because you liked that one English class in high school? I clenched my fists under the table. This isn't a phase. This is my career. My dad finally spoke again, setting his knife down with a deliberate clink against his plate. Programming isn't a real career, Alex. It's a side skill. You think companies want to hire a guy who just sits behind a keyboard? No. They want leaders, decision makers, people who can run businesses. That's why you're in business administration. I knew this argument was coming. I'd heard it before, just not directed at me. Dad, do you have any idea how much money software engineers make? It's one of the fastest growing industries in the world. It's not just about coding. It's about problem solving, development, security, AI. It's a waste of time, he interrupted, his voice now carrying that authoritative finality he always used to shut down arguments. You think you know more than me? Than us? We've built successful careers. We know what it takes. You're 23, Alex. You've barely lived. You don't get to make decisions like this. That last sentence hit me like a punch to the stomach. I don't get to make decisions about my own life. My mother sighed dramatically, shaking her head. You're not good at making decisions, sweetheart. That's why we guide you. You always get excited about new things and don't think them through. I stared at them in disbelief. This wasn't a discussion. This was a shutdown. A full-on parental intervention to keep me from stepping out of their carefully laid-out script. And I realized something, sitting there at that polished oak dining table, surrounded by their judgmental stares. I wasn't their son. I was their project. A carefully managed investment they expected to yield results in the form of a corporate job, a respectable salary, and a life that fit their standards. I pushed my chair back. I'm doing it, I said, my voice steady. With or without your support. My dad's jaw tightened. And how exactly do you plan to pay for this little rebellion? There it was. The ultimate leverage. They paid for my tuition, my living expenses, my entire life. They controlled everything, and they knew it. I exhaled slowly. I'll figure it out. My mom let out a short, bitter laugh. Oh, you'll figure it out? With what money, Alex? You think you can suddenly become independent just because you want to? You're being naive. Maybe, I admitted. But I'd rather be naive than miserable. For the first time, my father's expression cracked, just slightly. He wasn't used to me standing up to him like this. But it wasn't enough to stop him. You're making a mistake, he said coldly. And when you fail, don't come running back to us. I swallowed the lump in my throat. I won't. And just like that, dinner was over. I went back to my room, my heart still racing. I had no idea how I was going to pull this off, how I'd afford tuition, rent, food. But I knew I couldn't stay under their control anymore. This was the first real decision I had ever made for myself. And no matter how hard it was going to be, I wasn't going back. I barely slept that night. Lying in my bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind kept replaying the dinner over and over again. The look on my father's face when he said I would fail. The way my mother dismissed me like I was a child who didn't know any better. I had known they wouldn't approve of my decision, but I hadn't expected this level of coldness. I kept thinking that maybe, by morning, things would settle. Maybe they would calm down. Maybe this was just their way of scaring me into obedience. But when I walked into the kitchen the next morning, my father was already waiting for me. His expression was unreadable, his suit perfectly pressed, a cup of black coffee in front of him. My mother stood by the sink, her arms crossed. If you're serious about this ridiculous decision, my father said without looking up from his phone, then you can start by learning how to live on your own. You have 24 hours to pack your things and leave. I froze. What? He finally looked at me, his gaze as sharp as a knife. You want to act like an adult? Then live like one. No more free ride. No tuition, no roof over your head, no handouts. You made your choice, Alex. Now deal with the consequences. My mother said nothing. She didn't even look at me. I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't just a warning. This wasn't just tough love. They were serious. But I don't have anywhere to go, I admitted, my voice cracking slightly. I don't even have enough money saved to. Not our problem, my father interrupted, sipping his coffee as if this was just another normal morning. You don't want to listen to us? Fine. Go prove us wrong. If you fail, maybe then you'll understand why we try to steer you in the right direction. I turned to my mother, silently pleading with her to say something, to stop this. But she just sighed, rubbing her temple like she had a headache. You knew this was coming, Alex. Actions have consequences. We're not going to coddle you forever. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. I had expected them to be angry. I had expected a fight. But I had never imagined they would actually throw me out. I turned on my heel and stormed back to my room, my hands shaking as I grabbed my phone and called the only person I knew I could trust, Nick. He picked up on the second ring. Hey man, what's up? I swallowed the lump in my throat. I need a place to crash. Just for a little while. Nick didn't even hesitate. What happened? I exhaled slowly, trying to keep my voice steady. My parents are kicking me out. I have 24 hours. There was a pause. Then, dude, are you serious? Yeah. Another pause, then a sharp exhale on his end. All right, listen. My place is tiny as hell, but I've got a couch. You can stay as long as you need to figure things out. Just get over here. Relief hit me like a wave, but it was quickly followed by the crushing realization that this was real. This was actually happening. I had to leave. I hung up and looked around my room. The room I had lived in my entire life. My books, my computer, the posters on my walls, the shelves filled with things that made up me. And now, I had to pack it all up and leave it behind. I started throwing clothes into my duffel bag, my hands shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. I shoved my laptop in next, grabbed my headphones, a few books, anything I thought I might need. But every time I picked something up, I kept thinking, how did it come to this? How did I go from being their son to just a problem they were getting rid of? As I packed, I kept waiting for them to change their minds. For my mom to knock on the door, to say they were overreacting. For my dad to sit me down and talk this through. But it never happened. Hours passed. I heard them moving around the house, going about their day like nothing was wrong. They didn't check on me. They didn't ask if I had a plan. They didn't care. By evening, I was almost done. I had 2 duffel bags packed with clothes and essentials, my backpack with my laptop, and a few personal items I couldn't bring myself to leave behind. That's when my dad appeared in my doorway, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed. Almost done? He asked, completely emotionless. I looked at him, searching for some hint of regret, some sign that he didn't actually want me to leave. But there was nothing. I nodded stiffly. Good, he said simply. Then, after a pause, don't expect to come crawling back when this doesn't work out. Something inside me snapped. I clenched my jaw, gripping the strap of my bag so tightly my knuckles turned white. I wouldn't come back even if I had nowhere else to go. For a second, just a second, I thought I saw something flicker in his expression. Maybe doubt, maybe regret. But then he straightened and stepped aside. Suit yourself. I walked past him without another word. My mother was sitting on the couch, flipping through a magazine like nothing was happening. She didn't even look up as I headed for the door. I hesitated, waiting, just waiting for her to say something. But she didn't. She just kept reading. I swallowed the lump in my throat, shifted my bags over my shoulder, and stepped out into the night. The door clicked shut behind me. And just like that, I was alone. Nick's apartment was barely bigger than a storage unit. The moment I stepped inside, I realized just how bad things were going to be. The air was thick with the smell of old takeout. The couch, my new bed, had a broken leg that made it tilt awkwardly to one side. And there were clothes scattered everywhere, a mix of Nick's and, I assumed, his occasional overnight guests. Yeah, sorry man, Nick said, shoving a pile of shirts off the armrest so I could at least sit down. It's a mess, but, you know, home sweet home. I forced a weak smile. It's better than the street. That was my reality now. No home, no money, no safety net. Just a duffel bag, a broken couch, and the sheer will to keep going. The first few days were a blur. I tried to keep up with my classes, studying in whatever quiet corner of campus I could find, but my focus was shot. My mind kept drifting back to my parents, to the house I'd lived in my whole life, to the warm bed that was now permanently off-limits to me. At night, I lay on that lumpy, creaking couch, staring at the ceiling, trying to push down the gnawing sense of betrayal and failure. It wasn't long before my savings started to disappear. I knew it was going to be tight, but I had underestimated just how expensive even the most basic survival was. Rent wasn't an issue since Nick refused to take my money, but food, transportation, school supplies, it all drained my account faster than I expected. I needed a job. The only place that would hire me on short notice with no experience outside of school was a fast food joint a few blocks from Nick's place. The manager, a grumpy middle-aged guy named Tony, barely looked up from his clipboard when he hired me. Night shifts, minimum wage, no free food, and if you're late, don't bother showing up again. That was it. No welcome speech, no training beyond a rushed tutorial on how to work the register and clean the grease traps. The job was miserable, the kind of work that drained every ounce of energy from your body, but somehow still left you feeling useless. I spent my nights taking orders from drunk customers, scraping dried ketchup off tables, and getting yelled at by Tony for being too slow with the fryer. The worst part? The smell. No matter how much I scrubbed in the shower afterward, the stink of grease and old fryer oil clung to my skin, to my clothes, even to my hair. I could feel it seeping into me, a constant reminder of where I was and how far I had fallen. During the day, I dragged myself to classes, running on 2 or 3 hours of sleep, barely able to keep my eyes open. The lectures blurred together, my notes were half-written nonsense, and every assignment felt like an impossible mountain to climb. Megan was the only thing keeping me from completely losing it. She was one of my closest friends from college, the kind of person who always knew when something was wrong, even if you didn't say a word. It only took her one look at me slumped over my laptop in the campus library for her to sit down and say, "All right, what's going on?" I didn't even try to lie. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, her green eyes filled with concern, fingers tapping anxiously against the table as I spoke. "Alex," she finally said, shaking her head. "This is insane. You can't keep going like this. You're running yourself into the ground." I let out a short, bitter laugh. "Yeah? What other choice do I have?" She sighed, pushing her hair out of her face. "I wish I could help, but," she hesitated, guilt flickering across her expression. "I'm barely keeping up with my own bills. My student loans are killing me." I shook my head quickly. "Megan, no. I wouldn't take your money even if you had it. You've already done enough just by listening." She reached across the table, squeezing my arm gently. "I'm serious, Alex. You need to take care of yourself. This whole I'll push through no matter what thing, it's not sustainable." I knew she was right, but I also knew I didn't have a choice. The weeks dragged on, each one worse than the last. My body was breaking down from exhaustion, my grades were slipping, and my mental state was deteriorating fast. I stopped dreaming. Or, at least, I stopped remembering my dreams. Sleep wasn't restful anymore. It was just short, empty blackouts between shifts, lectures, and moments of staring blankly at my laptop screen, unable to process a single word. I lost track of the last time I ate a proper meal. Most nights, I settled for whatever I could afford. Instant ramen, a bag of chips, whatever scraps Nick had lying around. The worst part was knowing that this wasn't temporary. I kept telling myself that I just had to push through, that something would give, that an opportunity would come along to fix everything. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was drowning. Dropping out of college felt like admitting defeat. I held on as long as I could, struggling through classes on 2 or 3 hours of sleep, barely staying awake during lectures, showing up to exams with a brain too fried to process anything. But no amount of stubbornness could change the numbers in my bank account. Tuition payments were due, and I had nothing. I tried to talk to the financial aid office, hoping for some last-minute solution, some emergency assistance that would keep me enrolled. But without my parents' support, I had no options. No loans, no scholarships, nothing. And so, I signed the withdrawal forms. Walking out of that office, I felt hollow. I had spent years chasing a degree I didn't even want, only to lose at the moment I finally decided to follow my own path. The irony stung, but not as much as the crushing realization that I had just lost the only real shot I had at a better future. Nick didn't say much when I told him. He just handed me a beer and muttered, "Guess that makes two of us." Megan, though, looked devastated. "Alex, no. There has to be another way." "There isn't," I said flatly. "It's over." I could see the helplessness in her eyes, but she didn't argue. She knew I had already made peace with it, or at least convinced myself I had. Without school to juggle, I threw myself completely into work. I picked up more hours at the fast food place, going from miserable night shifts to even worse 12-hour stretches, flipping burgers, mopping floors, dealing with customers who treated me like I wasn't even human. The worst part was seeing people my age come in after their classes, laughing with their friends, talking about exams and assignments and weekend plans. They had no idea how lucky they were, how fragile that life was, how quickly it could all be ripped away. But even with all those hours, it still wasn't enough. So I found a second job. A warehouse on the outskirts of town was looking for night shift security guards. No experience necessary, just a willingness to stay awake and keep an eye on things. The pay was slightly better than fast food, and I didn't have the energy to be picky. The job was simple: walk the perimeter, check the cameras, write a few reports. But the hours were brutal. I would clock out of the fast food joint at 7 in the evening, grab a quick meal that usually consisted of whatever I could get for cheap, then head straight to the warehouse and work from 8 at night until 4 in the morning. By the time I stumbled back to Nick's place, the sun was already rising. Sleep became a luxury. Some days, I managed 2 or 3 hours. Others, none at all. My body stopped feeling like my own. My limbs were heavy, my head constantly a fog of exhaustion, my chest tight from the stress of knowing that if I ever slipped up, if I ever missed a shift or got sick, I would be completely screwed. I started keeping track of the days by how many energy drinks I had gone through. 1 meant I was barely holding on. 2 meant I was running on fumes. 3 meant I was pushing my body past whatever limits it had left. Megan begged me to slow down. "This isn't sustainable, Alex. You're going to collapse." "I don't have a choice," I told her, my voice numb. She stared at me, frustrated and heartbroken at the same time. But what could she say? What could she do? Neither of us had an answer. The warehouse job should have been easy, but even there, the exhaustion made everything harder. I lost track of how many times I nodded off while watching the security monitors, jerking awake in a panic, terrified that I had just cost myself the only thing keeping me afloat. Some nights, I walked the perimeter in a daze, barely aware of my own footsteps. Other nights, I caught myself staring at my reflection in the dark warehouse windows, barely recognizing the person looking back. I had lost weight. My face was hollow, my skin pale from lack of sunlight. My eyes, once sharp and full of something that resembled ambition, were now dull and lifeless. I had become a machine. Work, eat, work again, sleep, if I was lucky, repeat. I told myself it was temporary, that I was just doing what I had to do to survive. But the truth was, I didn't know if I would ever escape it. It was just another exhausting shift at the fast food joint, the kind that blurred together into a monotonous cycle of grease, sweat, and mind-numbing repetition. By the time my break rolled around, I felt like a zombie, running on caffeine and sheer willpower. I grabbed my usual cup of cheap coffee, found a corner table in the back, and pulled out my laptop. Even though I had dropped out, I hadn't given up on coding. Late at night, when my body refused to sleep, I would go through tutorials, build small projects, try to hold on to the one thing that still felt like it mattered. It was the only part of my day that reminded me of who I wanted to be, not just who I had become. That day, I was working through a simple algorithm problem, barely noticing the noise around me. The beeping fryers, the chatter of customers, the distant shouting from the kitchen. My mind was locked in, the way it always was when I was deep into a problem. I didn't even hear him approach. "Hey," a voice said, snapping me out of my focus. "What are you working on?" I blinked, looking up. The man standing in front of me was in his late 30s, wearing a button-up and jeans, a laptop bag slung over his shoulder. He didn't look like a regular. I stammered, realizing how out of place my screen probably looked in this setting. "Just some coding exercises." His eyes flicked back to my laptop. "Python?" I nodded cautiously. "Yeah." He grinned. You studying computer science? I hesitated for half a second. I didn't want to explain everything. How I had been, how I wasn't anymore, how life had derailed completely. I said simply. He pulled out the chair across from me and sat down like we were old friends. You any good? I let out a short laugh, more from exhaustion than amusement. I like to think so. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a business card, and slid it across the table. Name's Jason, he said. I work at a software company downtown. We're looking for junior devs. No formal degree required, just people who know what they're doing. I stared at the card, my brain taking an extra second to process what had just happened. Jason leaned back in his chair. You ever thought about getting into the industry? I looked up at him, my heart pounding in a way it hadn't in months. Yeah, I said. I have. That night, I sat on Nick's broken couch, Jason's business card burning a hole in my pocket. I had stared at it for hours, turning it over in my fingers, convincing myself it wasn't real, that it was some kind of mistake, a cruel joke life was playing on me. People like me didn't get chances like this. Not after everything that had happened. But something in me, maybe desperation, maybe sheer exhaustion, pushed me to open my laptop and start writing my resume. It was a mess at first. I hadn't looked at it since dropping out, and seeing it now only reminded me of how much I had lost. My education section was incomplete, my work history was nothing but fast food and warehouse shifts, and I had no formal experience in programming beyond the projects I had done on my own. For a moment, I considered closing my laptop and pretending the whole thing never happened. But then I thought about Jason. He had seen me coding in the middle of a fast food break room, and instead of brushing me off, he had given me a shot. He hadn't cared about my degree. He had only asked if I was good. So I made my resume about that. I listed every project I had ever built, every coding challenge I had solved, every hour I had spent buried in documentation and tutorials. I didn't have a diploma, but I had something better, proof that I knew what I was doing. I hit send before I could second-guess myself. The next morning, I woke up to an email. Hey Alex, got your resume. Can you come in for an interview this week? I had to read it 3 times before it sank in. I replied immediately, trying not to sound too eager, and within an hour, I had an interview scheduled at a small startup downtown. The panic set in soon after. I had nothing to wear. My best shirt was wrinkled beyond saving, and my only decent pair of shoes had been ruined by months of working in greasy kitchens. Nick offered me one of his old button-ups, which was a size too big, but at least it was clean. The day of the interview, I took the bus to their office, gripping my laptop bag so tightly my knuckles turned white. The whole ride, I kept telling myself that this was pointless, that they would see right through me, that I had no business even sitting in that room. But when I stepped inside, something shifted. The office was small, nothing like the sleek corporate buildings I had imagined. A few desks pushed together, a coffee machine that had probably been there since the early 2000s, a couple of people in hoodies staring intensely at their screens. It wasn't intimidating. It felt real. Jason met me at the front and introduced me to the lead developer, a guy named Mark who had the kind of tired eyes that only came from too many late nights debugging code. The interview was brutal. They didn't care about my resume. They didn't ask about school or degrees. They opened a laptop, handed it to me, and said, "Solve this." For the first time in months, I felt awake. The problem wasn't easy, but it wasn't impossible either. My fingers moved on instinct, years of self-taught coding kicking in. I explained my logic as I typed, showed them my thought process, and when I finished, I looked up, expecting to see disappointment. Instead, Mark just nodded. Not bad. They asked me a few more technical questions, pushing me, testing me, but I held my ground. By the end of the interview, I was drenched in sweat, convinced I had bombed it. Then Jason clapped me on the back. You start Monday. I blinked. Wait, what? Mark smirked. You heard him. I walked out of that office feeling like I was floating. For the first time in a long time, I had won. Walking into the fast food joint for my last shift felt surreal. For months, I had stood behind that counter, flipping burgers, mopping floors, taking orders from impatient customers who barely looked me in the eye. It had become my reality, a place where I had convinced myself I would be stuck forever. But now, I was walking out. I handed in my resignation, ignored Tony's usual grumbling about kids these days, and stepped out the door without looking back. I wasn't stupid, though. I kept the security job at the warehouse. The startup was promising, but it was still a startup, and I couldn't afford to gamble everything on it. I had spent too many nights wondering where my next meal would come from to make that mistake again. So I kept working nights, patrolling empty aisles of stacked pallets, running on caffeine and sheer willpower. But during the day, I was someone else entirely. At the office, I was no longer just a guy struggling to survive. I was a developer, a real one, sitting at a desk with a company laptop, working on real projects with real deadlines. I had never been more exhausted in my life. I spent every spare second absorbing everything I could, reading documentation, studying code bases, asking questions, taking on extra work just to prove myself. I knew I was the least experienced person there, but I wasn't going to let that stop me. Slowly, people started to notice. My coworkers, guys who had been coding for years, started asking for my input. I wasn't just keeping up, I was pushing myself ahead. Then, one afternoon, Tina, the lead engineer and probably the most intimidating person in the office, pulled me aside. "You're taking on a lot," she said, arms crossed. I braced myself for criticism. "Yeah, I just want to get better." She studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Good, because I have something for you." She handed me a folder. "New client, big project. We need a backend overhaul, and I want you on it." I stared at her, barely able to process what was happening. "Me? You've earned it," she said simply. I didn't know what to say. For so long, I had been stuck in survival mode, convinced that every opportunity would slip through my fingers. But this was real. I worked harder than I ever had, pouring every bit of myself into the project. And it paid off. The launch was a success. The client was thrilled. The team noticed. 2 weeks later, Jason pulled me into a meeting and handed me a new contract. "You're full-time now," he said, grinning. "And we're bumping your salary." For the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe. No more fast food. No more warehouse shifts. I had made it. A few years ago, I was scraping grease off a fast food fryer, wondering if I'd ever get out of the hole I was in. Now, I was sitting in my own office, in my own company, looking at a list of clients that just kept growing. It didn't happen overnight. After that first big project, things started moving fast. I kept climbing, taking on more responsibility, proving myself over and over again. The startup grew, and so did my skills. Within 2 years, I was leading my own team, handling bigger clients, making more money than I had ever thought possible back when I was struggling to afford instant ramen. But something kept nagging at me. I didn't just want to work for someone else. I wanted to build something of my own. So, I took the leap. It was terrifying at first. Leaving a stable job, risking everything to start my own company. It felt like walking off a cliff. But I wasn't that kid sleeping on Nick's couch anymore. I had experience, connections, and a reputation for getting things done. And people noticed. The first few months were slow, but then the contracts started coming in. Small businesses, startups, companies looking for someone who could deliver results. I put in the hours, built my team, and before I knew it, we were expanding. The feeling of hiring my first employee was surreal. The feeling of landing a six-figure contract? Even more so. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building something real. One night, after another long day at the office, I sat down with Megan over dinner, watching her talk about her latest project with the same passion I had for mine. And it hit me. I had spent so many years fighting to keep my head above water, never thinking beyond the next paycheck, the next bill, the next crisis. But now, for the first time, I could think about something bigger, something permanent. So I bought a house. Not an apartment, not a rental, a real house, with enough space for both of us, a home office, and a future that I finally felt like I had control over. When I handed Megan the keys, she just stared at me, speechless. "You're serious?" she whispered. I smiled. "I think we've both waited long enough for this." She threw her arms around me, holding on tight, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I had truly won. I wasn't even looking for it. I was just scrolling through listings, half out of curiosity, half out of habit, when I saw the photo. The house I had grown up in, the one I had been thrown out of, staring back at me from a real estate website with a bright red for sale banner slapped across it. For a second, I thought I was imagining it. I clicked on the listing, my heart pounding. The address was the same. The photos showed the living room where I had sat through countless tense family dinners, the hallway where I used to race from my bedroom to the kitchen as a kid, the backyard where I had once built a pathetic treehouse that collapsed within a week. It was real, and it was for sale. I sat there, staring at the screen, trying to make sense of it. My parents had always acted like they had everything together, like their way was the only way, like I had ruined my future by walking away from the life they had planned for me. So why were they selling the house? A few calls later, I got my answer. The house wasn't really theirs to sell. They had been renting it all these years, something they had never once mentioned to me. And now, their landlord was offloading properties, forcing them to either buy it or move out. But they couldn't afford it. I sat back, running a hand through my hair, letting the realization sink in. The people who had kicked me out, convinced I would fail, were now the ones struggling. And suddenly, I knew exactly what I was going to do. I was going to buy that house. Buying the house was easier than I expected. I had the money. That alone still felt surreal sometimes, knowing I had built myself up from nothing to the point where I could make a purchase like this without hesitation. The sale went through quickly. No complications, no delays. Within a few weeks, the paperwork was finalized and the house I had been thrown out of all those years ago, belonged to me. I didn't tell my parents. I wanted them to find out the way I had found out, through a stranger handing them unexpected news. I didn't know what kind of reaction I expected from them: shock, anger, denial. But I knew one thing for sure: they wouldn't see it coming. A few days later, I got a call from the real estate agent. "Hey, the current tenants, your parents, want to meet the new owner before they discuss their next steps." I almost laughed. The idea that they still thought they had any control over the situation was ridiculous. But I kept my voice neutral. "Sure," I said. "Set up a meeting." The date was set for the following afternoon. I took the rest of the day to think about how I wanted to handle it. I ran through scenarios in my head, imagining how my father would react, how my mother would try to smooth things over, how they might even convince themselves I was there to bail them out. By the time I arrived at the house, I had made up my mind. I wasn't coming as their son. I was coming as their landlord. When I knocked on the door, it took a moment before I heard footsteps on the other side. Then the door swung open, and there they were. My father froze, his expression instantly hardening. My mother's eyes widened, her mouth parting slightly in disbelief. Neither of them said a word. I let the silence stretch between us for a moment, then slid my hands into my pockets and gave them a calm, polite nod. "I hear you wanted to meet your new landlord," I said. Their shock deepened, my mother's hand flying to her chest like she needed something to hold on to. My father's lips pressed into a tight line. I tilted my head slightly. "Well," I continued, letting the words sink in, "here I am." The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. My mother was still frozen in shock, her eyes darting between me and my father as if waiting for him to say something that would make sense of the situation. My father, on the other hand, wasn't one to stay quiet for long. "This is a joke," he finally said, his voice low and sharp. "You didn't buy this house." I pulled a neatly folded paper from my pocket and held it out. "The deed is in my name. You can check if you want." My mother reached for it hesitantly, her hands trembling as she scanned the official document. The moment she saw the name at the top, her breath hitched. She pressed her lips together, like she was holding back tears. This isn't possible," she whispered. I kept my expression neutral. "It is." My father exhaled sharply through his nose, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might crack. "All right," he said, regaining some of his composure. "Fine. You own the house. What do you want?" I shrugged. "Nothing unreasonable. Just the same thing any other landlord would want: rent." My mother's face twisted in desperation. "Alex, please, we've lived here for years. We can't afford anything extravagant right now. We just need some time to figure things out." I gave her a small, almost sympathetic nod. "I understand. But, unfortunately, the market has changed." I let that sink in before delivering the blow. "Starting next month, the rent will be 3 times what you've been paying." Her hand flew to her mouth. 3 times. My father exploded. "That's insane." "No," I said, my voice calm and even. "That's business." He stepped toward me, his fists tightening at his sides. "You think this is funny? You think you can waltz in here and treat us like strangers?" I met his glare without flinching. "That's exactly what you did to me." His nostrils flared, his face going red. "We're your parents. And I was your son," I said, my tone turning colder. "But you made it clear that didn't mean anything when you threw me out. You told me to figure it out on my own. And I did." I tilted my head slightly, letting the moment stretch. "Now it's your turn." My mother let out a quiet sob, but my father refused to back down. "You're punishing us," he growled. I shook my head. "No, Dad. You're the one who always said emotions don't belong in business. This isn't personal. It's just the cost of living." His breath came out in a sharp, furious exhale. He wanted to argue, to fight, to find some way to turn this around. But there was nothing he could say, because he had taught me everything I needed to know. My mother wiped at her eyes, her voice trembling as she took a cautious step toward me. "Alex, honey, please, we're still your parents. We raised you. We loved you. You can't really expect us to pay that much. We're family." I felt something inside me tighten, but I didn't let it show. I had spent years craving those words, hoping that maybe one day she would say something like that, not out of desperation, but because she actually meant it. But I wasn't that naive kid anymore. "Family," I repeated slowly, my voice calm, measured. "Where was that sentiment when you kicked me out with nowhere to go?" She flinched like I had struck her. "That was different," she said quickly. "You needed to learn responsibility, to stand on your own 2 feet." I nodded slightly, pretending to consider her words. "And I did. I survived. I built a life without your help. And now here we are." My father let out a bitter scoff. "Oh, come on, Alex. You're seriously holding a grudge? That was years ago. We were doing what was best for you." I turned to face him directly. "Best for me? I slept on a broken couch in a friend's apartment. I worked 18-hour shifts just to afford food. I lost everything trying to survive. But sure, let's call that best for me. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He knew I wasn't exaggerating. My mother sniffled, her voice softening. Sweetheart, we just need some time. You know how much this house means to us. Please, you don't have to do this. I could hear the desperation creeping in. This was her last attempt to appeal to my emotions, to make me feel guilty, to pull on whatever strings of attachment I might have left. I inhaled slowly, steadying myself. Do you remember my last night here? I asked quietly. Because I do. I remember standing in this very doorway, hoping you'd change your mind, hoping you'd say something, anything, to stop me from leaving. But you didn't. She looked away, shame flickering in her eyes. I continued. I remember what Dad said that night, too. I turned toward him. You told me not to come crawling back when I failed. You made it clear I wasn't your responsibility anymore. My father's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent. I exhaled, letting the weight of my words settle. So, let me return the favor, I said, my voice firm, unwavering. I'm not your responsibility either. And this isn't personal. It's just business. My mother let out a quiet sob, and my father turned away, his hands clenched into fists. But I had made my decision, and nothing they said would change it. The silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken words. My mother's face was streaked with tears, her expression one of raw desperation. My father stood stiffly, his arms crossed, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought he might break a tooth. Neither of them spoke, as if they were still trying to process the reality of what I had just told them. I let them sit with it for a moment before I delivered my final decision. You have two options, I said, my voice steady. You can either pay the new rent or find somewhere else to live. My mother let out a choked sob. Alex, please, don't do this. My father, ever the prideful man, straightened his shoulders, his nostrils flaring. You think you can just throw us out, he spat. After everything we did for you? I exhaled slowly, shaking my head. I'm not throwing you out. I'm giving you the same choice you gave me. Figure it out on your own. His face darkened with rage, but he said nothing. He knew I was right. My mother took a shaky breath. Where will we go? That's not my problem. I replied, the words sharp but true. I had spent too many nights wondering where I would sleep, too many mornings waking up on a lumpy couch, too many hours working jobs that broke me just to survive. They hadn't cared then. They had told me it was my lesson to learn, my burden to carry. Now it was theirs. For the first time in my life, I was in control. I turned toward the door, pausing just before stepping outside. I meant what I said, I added, glancing back at them. This isn't personal. It's just business. My father's fists tightened at his sides. My mother's sobs grew louder, but I didn't wait for a response. I stepped out, feeling the crisp evening air hit my face, and walked away from the house that had once been my entire world. But it wasn't anymore. I had my own life now, my own home, my own success. And for the first time in years, I was completely free. I stood outside my own house, the home I had bought for myself, the life I had built with my own hands, and for the first time in years, I felt truly at peace. The weight that had sat on my chest for so long, the bitterness, the resentment, it was gone. I had won. I had spent so much of my life chasing their approval, trying to be the son they wanted, breaking myself to meet expectations that had never really been mine. But in the end, I didn't need their validation. I had built something better, something real. I had a career I was proud of, a business that was thriving, a home that was truly mine. And most importantly, I had people in my life who actually cared about me. Nick, who had given me a place to sleep when I had nothing, Megan, who had stood by my side through every struggle, and the team I had built, who saw me as a leader, not a disappointment. Looking back at my parents' house, I didn't feel anger anymore. I didn't feel the sting of betrayal, the pain of abandonment, or the desperate need to prove something to them. I just felt satisfaction. They had thrown me out believing I would fail. Instead, I had become everything they had never thought possible. And the best part? I hadn't needed them to do it. I turned away from that house, knowing I would never look back again. This was my life now. And for the first time, it was truly mine. Some people might call what I did revenge, but I don't see it that way. This wasn't about getting even, about humiliating them, about making them suffer. It was about fairness. It was about giving them exactly what they had given me, a lesson in survival. They had made a choice all those years ago. They had looked me in the eye, told me I wasn't their responsibility anymore, and thrown me into a world that I wasn't ready for. And now, they were the ones standing in that same storm, without a safety net, without anyone to turn to. And just like they had told me back then, I had my own life to worry about. They hadn't just lost their home. They had lost me. Not because I had walked away, but because they had pushed me away long before I ever had the chance to turn back. And now, They had to live with that. I don't feel bad for them. Not because I'm heartless, not because I want them to suffer, but because I spent years suffering at their hands, and they never once showed me mercy. They had every opportunity to be different, to be better, to make things right. But they didn't. And now, as I stand here, with everything I built, with people who truly care about me, with a future that belongs only to me, I realize something. I don't need them. I never did. But what do you think? Was I too harsh? Would you have done the same in my place? Let me know. I'd love to hear your thoughts.